There is a highway in southern Ukraine that Russian soldiers have started calling something else entirely, not by its official number, by a nickname. And nicknames like this one don't get invented for roads that are working fine. For weeks, convoy after convoy went out on this stretch of asphalt and didn't come back intact. Trucks became wreckage, fuel tankers became fire, and the men who had to keep driving it anyway gave it a name that tells you everything about what it's like to be a Russian logistics officer in the south of Ukraine right now, the Highway of Death. But this isn't a story about a road. It's a story about what happens when an army's supply lines stop being background infrastructure and start being the main battlefield, and about one small, unremarkable strip of sand where that shift became impossible to hide. On June 25, 2026, Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces released footage of a blue and yellow flag flying over a rooftop on the Kinburn Spit, a narrow finger of land in Mykolaiv Oblast that Russian troops had occupied since March 2022, more than 4 years. The statement accompanying the video was blunt. Russian forces had been driven from their positions under sustained fire, survivors were being evacuated, and the defensive lines were being abandoned. It should have been an unambiguous win. It wasn't presented as one. Within hours, Ukrainian Navy spokesperson Dmytro Pletenchuk told reporters that yes, Russian troops had been forced out of some positions, but the Spit remained an active combat zone. Russian units were still present, and it was too early to call it liberated. Military analysts were even more careful, warning that what looked like a full withdrawal might just be a rotation, a repositioning, not a collapse. So here is the part that should stop you. An army doesn't publicize a flag and then immediately undercut its own headline unless it has no reason to lie. Ukraine's own spokespeople talked this moment down, not up. Which means the real question isn't whether the flag matters. It's why an elite Russian regiment abandoned a position it had held, uncontested, for 4 straight years, without a single reported Ukrainian assault crossing that ground. Because that's what actually happened. There was no amphibious landing, no armored push, no footage of trench clearing under fire. The Kinburn Spit didn't fall to a battle. It fell to a supply chain that stopped functioning. The first crack in the story appeared 17 days earlier on June 8th when the Ukrainian resistance network Atesh, which operates informants inside Russian command structures, reported that units of Russia's 337th Regiment, an airborne formation, were abandoning positions on the Spit. According to Atesh's source inside the headquarters of Russia's Dnipro group of forces, ammunition, fuel, and food deliveries had been completely severed. The report described a garrison being quietly bled dry, its command shuffling the same handful of exhausted soldiers between gaps that kept reopening faster than they could be patched. This is where the financial and strategic picture behind the story starts to matter. On May 27th, Ukraine's defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov announced a program called Logistics Lockdown. Roughly $111 to $113 million in direct funding channeled to the drone units proving most effective at hitting Russian supply routes 20 to 300 kilometers behind the front line. Not the front line itself, the roads, depots, fuel points, and rail junctions that keep the front line fed. Fedorov didn't hide the logic. He said Ukrainian forces had quadrupled their strikes on Russian logistics infrastructure, and that the cost of Russian advances was climbing as a direct result, from 67 soldiers lost per square kilometer of ground gained in October to 179 by April, nearly triple in 6 months, without Russia capturing meaningfully more territory. According to Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, mid-range strike missions rose 28-fold over the past year. CNN's reporting on the campaign, drawing on independent open-source analysts, documented hundreds of Russian vehicles destroyed along the corridors feeding Crimea and southern Ukraine, with strike density climbing week over week through May and June. One highway between occupied Melitopol and Crimea was, by early June, described by journalists tracking geolocated footage as littered with burned-out trucks and tankers along its length. Russian-backed authorities in occupied Luhansk went as far as banning military transit on two of the main resupply highways from Russian territory altogether, citing the frequency of the strikes. Crimean regional authorities began rationing fuel, government vehicles only, no private or commercial access. Money is the through line here, and it's worth sitting with for a second because it's the part that should genuinely worry Moscow. A mid-range strike drone costs a fraction, often less than 1%, of the vehicle, cargo, or position it destroys. Ukraine is spending roughly $111 million to systematically degrade a logistics network that took Russia years and untold billions to build across occupied southern Ukraine. That is not a fair fight in the traditional sense. It's a fight where one side's cost curve is falling and the other side's is rising, and the Kinburn garrison was simply the first position where that math ran out completely. And here is the detail that, more than any battlefield footage, tells you what was really happening on that sandbar. Pletenchuk didn't describe the Kinburn withdrawal as a single event. He described it, on the same day the flag went up, as part of a consistent process of destroying Russian logistics that had been running for over a year. Not weeks, not months, a year. Kinburn wasn't a surprise victory. It was the point where a slow strangulation finally became visible from the outside. The caution in Ukraine's own statements wasn't modesty. It was Ukraine describing something still in motion, because the same method was already being applied everywhere else along Russia's southern supply network. That's worth pausing on, because it's tempting to treat Kinburn as proof that Crimea itself is next. It isn't that simple, and the honest version of this story has to say so. Kinburn was defended by one regiment with a single vulnerable supply corridor and water on three sides, a geography that made it uniquely exposed. Crimea is not that. Crimea holds tens of thousands of troops, multiple supply routes, and is, for the Kremlin, close to non-negotiable politically. Analyst Alexander Kovalenko of the Information Resistance Group has been explicit that a Russian pullback from one exposed position doesn't automatically mean the same thing will happen at scale elsewhere, and that Ukraine holding contested ground long-term is a very different challenge from forcing a short-term retreat. Ukraine's own military leadership, per Kyiv-based reporting, has said there's no indication of an imminent ground offensive toward Crimea. This is degradation, not invasion. At least, not yet. But degradation adds up, and the broader pattern is where this stops being a local story about one sandbar and becomes a story about the entire southern front. In the 2 weeks before the Kinburn flag went up, Ukrainian mid-range drones reportedly closed all three of the main road corridors linking occupied Crimea to the Russian-held mainland: Chonhar, the Henishevsk crossing to the Arabat Spit, and the bridges near Armyansk. Sometimes multiple times in the same week, faster than repair crews could keep pace. By Kyiv's own accounting, military cargo traffic on Russia's main Crimean supply highway had dropped by roughly 71%. Sevastopol, home of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, moved to rationing fuel by the leader, tracked through QR codes at the pump. Fedorov, in a June 17th interview, put it in 6 words that need no interpretation. Hell is beginning. Logistics are being cut off. Ukraine's stated goal, according to officials briefed on the strategy, is not to storm Crimea outright, but to make holding it so expensive that the occupation effectively withers where it stands, which brings the story back to that sandbar and to 4 words buried in Ukraine's own announcement: evacuation of surviving personnel, not retreating, not repositioning, surviving. That word choice describes an army that ran out of options, not one that lost a fight, and it raises the only question that actually matters going forward, not whether this method works, because Kinburn already answered that. The question is where Ukraine decides to point it next. The unit that raised that flag didn't stop at a symbolic gesture. In their own statement, Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces added a line that reads less like celebration and more like a declaration of intent. We are not stopping. One day our tanks will reach Jankoy. Jankoy is the railway junction in northern Crimea where every major supply line into the peninsula converges. The single node that, if it stopped functioning, would leave Russia's entire Crimean garrison as isolated as the paratroopers on Kinburn were in their final weeks. Nobody serious is claiming that's imminent. But 4 years ago, nobody would have called a Ukrainian flag on the Kinburn Spit imminent either. Russia held this ground for 4 years because it understood exactly what it was worth. It's leaving, however slowly, however contested the final inch turns out to be, because a fuel truck couldn't get through, and because $111 million spent on drones is proving more decisive than 4 years spent on fortifications. The question now hanging over every exposed Russian position from Kherson Oblast to the Kerch Strait is a simple one. Which garrison runs out of fuel next? Tell us in the comments which position you think falls first. And if you want to see exactly how Ukraine is systematically isolating the entire Crimean Peninsula, one bridge and one convoy at a time, that's the investigation waiting for you next. This has been Geopolitical Investigation into the War in Ukraine. I'm Dr. Nathan Mercer.